My name is Poppy Graham. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my professional life, I have been described with words like dependable, steady, supportive, and thoughtful. Not brilliant, not ambitious, not threatening, supportive. I live in Manchester, and I work in creative project strategy, one of those roles that sits quietly between vision and execution. I translate chaos into timelines. I turn big personalities into coordinated teams. I am the person people come to when something is almost falling apart, but not quite dramatic enough to admit publicly. Most people see me as calm, and they mistake that calm for softness. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for air in meetings. I don't perform confidently loudly. When I speak, I usually wait until everyone else is finished. By then, the room has often decided what it believes, and I have learned to live with that. For 3 years, I worked under a woman I considered more than a manager. She called herself my mentor. She called me little sister. She took me to coffee. She told me I had potential. She said she saw herself in me, and I believed her. She was sharp, charismatic, effortlessly authoritative, the kind of woman who walked into a room and reshaped its temperature. Clients adored her. Leadership trusted her instincts. When she endorsed someone, their career accelerated. When she criticized someone, the doors closed quietly. Standing next to her felt like proximity to sunlight. This story isn't about a dramatic betrayal. There were no screaming matches, no explosive accusations, no office-wide scandal. It was quieter than that. It was the slow realization that every project delay, every miscommunication, every budget misstep had somehow begun attaching itself to my name. Not publicly, not loudly, but consistently. In meetings, she would sigh gently and say, "Poppy's still learning." In email threads, she would clarify decisions I had supposedly misunderstood. In leadership reviews, she would reassure them she was guiding me through my growth areas. And I thought she was protecting me, until the day I discovered she wasn't shielding me from mistakes. She was assigning them to me. This is not a revenge story. I didn't burn anything down. I didn't scream. I didn't expose her in a dramatic presentation, with highlighted screenshots and trembling hands. What I did was much quieter. What I did changed everything. This story is about how easy it is to mistake mentorship for management of blame. It's about how invisibility can be engineered. And it's about the moment you realize that silence isn't humility, it's positioning. I'm not telling this story to humiliate anyone. I'm telling it because some of you may be living inside a dynamic you haven't named yet. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you didn't notice the narrative they were writing about you behind your back? Before I understood what was happening, I understood my place. In every meeting, there is an invisible seating chart. Not where you physically sit, but where you exist in the hierarchy of attention. I was the one people turned to when they needed clarification, but not credit. The one copied on emails when something required organization, but removed when it required praise. I wasn't ignored. That would have been easier to detect. I was utilized. When I joined the agency at 29, I arrived with experience, but not noise. I didn't announce my achievements. I didn't perform authority. I assumed competence would reveal itself over time. It did. But competence without spectacle is often categorized as support. My mentor, I'll call her Caroline, saw me quickly. Or at least that's what I believed. She praised my structure. She admired my preparation. She told leadership I had rare strategic patience. When she introduced me to clients, she'd rest a hand lightly at my back and say, "She keeps us on track." It sounded like an endorsement, and in a way it was. But what I didn't notice then was the subtle framing. She keeps us on track. Not she leads execution. Not she designed the timeline. Not she negotiated that deliverable. Keeps us on track. Support language. Over time, a pattern formed. Caroline was visionary. I was infrastructure. Caroline was innovative. I was implementing. Caroline presented, I formatted the deck. It didn't feel unfair. It felt collaborative. In fact, I took pride in being steady. When creative directors missed deadlines, I recalibrated timelines quietly. When clients changed scope mid-cycle, I absorbed the impact into revised budgets. When internal teams grew tense, I translated emotional friction into practical next steps. I rarely corrected misconceptions in real time. If someone misattributed an idea to Caroline that I had proposed in a prep session, I told myself it didn't matter. We were aligned. The project succeeded. That was enough. At least that's what I told myself. There is a particular kind of invisibility that feels noble at first. You convince yourself you are above ego. You frame silence as maturity. But invisibility accumulates. Performance reviews would arrive with language that puzzled me. Strong support presence. Still developing executive confidence. Needs more ownership over project outcomes. Ownership. I managed entire workflows. I forecasted risks before they surfaced. I briefed departments and negotiated extensions. What did ownership mean? When I asked Caroline for feedback, she would tilt her head sympathetically. "You're brilliant, Poppy," she'd say, "but leadership needs to see you taking responsibility when things wobble." Wobble. The word stayed with me. Because projects didn't wobble often. And when they did, they wobbled for reasons I had flagged weeks earlier. Scope creep, unclear client approvals, last-minute strategy shifts. But in leadership recaps, those nuances blurred. What remained was a simplified narrative. The team struggled. Poppy is still growing into ownership. I never accused her of misrepresenting me. At that stage, I didn't think she was. I thought I must be missing something. That's the insidious part of subtle repositioning. It makes you question your perception before you question the pattern. Colleagues liked me, designers trusted me, account managers confided in me. I was the emotional ballast of chaotic weeks. But in rooms where promotions were discussed, I was described as dependable, not decisive. Safe, not strategic. And the strangest part? Caroline would reassure me afterward. "These things take time," she'd say gently. "You're almost there." Almost where? I had no language yet for what was happening. I only knew that despite carrying more and more responsibility, my perceived authority remained suspended just out of reach. I was close enough to power to do the work, but far enough from it to absorb the fault. At the time, I believed that proximity to a strong mentor meant protection. I hadn't yet considered that proximity could also mean insulation for someone else. The first cut didn't bleed. That's why I almost missed it. It happened during a client debrief for a campaign that had launched 2 weeks behind schedule. Not a catastrophe. Not even unusual in our industry, but late enough that leadership wanted a clear explanation. I had flagged the risk early, twice in writing, once verbally. The delay had originated from a strategic pivot Caroline requested after the second round of creative review. A smarter direction, yes, but it required new assets, new copy, new approvals. Time had to stretch somewhere. In the meeting, the boardroom was colder than usual. Glass walls, polished oak table. Leadership sat at the far end like a quiet tribunal. Caroline began the recap. She spoke fluently, confidently. Hands relaxed on the table. She described the campaign's performance, highlighted client satisfaction, and emphasized strong engagement metrics. Then she sighed, just slightly. "We did have some internal timeline mismanagement early on," she said gently, "but Poppy's been learning to anticipate strategic shifts better. We've had good conversations about it." I remember the exact sensation. Not anger, not panic, confusion. Internal timeline mismanagement. I felt my body go very still. The kind of stillness that happens when your brain begins scanning backwards, searching for evidence you've misunderstood something. Had I missed something? Had I failed to escalate clearly enough? Had I miscommunicated impact? No one in the room looked shocked. No one challenged the statement. It landed as reasonable. Because it sounded reasonable. She didn't accuse me. She didn't criticize harshly. She framed it as growth, as mentorship, as a shared reflection. I nodded. That's the detail that stayed with me later. I nodded. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my desk slowly. I opened my black leather notebook. I flipped to the page dated 6 weeks earlier. There it was. Flag, if strategy pivots after creative round 2, minimum plus 12 days required. Below that in blue ink, CR agreed risk is manageable. CR Caroline. I stared at it longer than necessary. Still, I didn't confront her. Not immediately. Instead, I did what I had trained myself to do. I rationalized. Maybe she forgot the conversation. Maybe she meant timeline adjustment, not mismanagement. Maybe leadership needed a simplified explanation. That's the thing about being the calm one. You are very good at explaining other people's behavior generously. Later that afternoon, she stopped by my desk. "You handled that well," she said warmly. "These conversations are part of stepping up." Stepping up. I forced a small smile. Of course. She leaned slightly closer. Just try to anticipate my pivots earlier next time. My pivots. It was subtle. So subtle that if you replayed it out loud, it sounded harmless, almost collaborative. But something inside me registered the asymmetry. The pivot had been hers. The risk had been documented. The timeline impact had been acknowledged. Yet the language in the room positioned the delay as my developmental gap. That night, I didn't rage, I didn't cry. I replayed the meeting like a quiet analyst reviewing footage. The tone of her voice, the framing of, "We've had good conversations," the way leadership nodded sympathetically at her mentorship. It was elegant. That's when I felt the first hairline fracture in my certainty. Not certainty about her character, certainty about my perception. Because the external world still treated her as my advocate, and she still treated me kindly in private. But something had shifted. A single sentence had repositioned ownership without confrontation, without evidence, without resistance. And the most unsettling part? I had participated in it by staying silent. That was the first small cut. No blood, no accusation, just a slight redirection of weight. And once weight shifts, once without consequence, it becomes easier to shift again. After the first cut, I told myself to pay attention. Not in a paranoid way, not in a defensive way, just attentively. But something strange happens when you begin observing a pattern you don't want to confirm. You see it, and then you soften it. The next instance was smaller. A client presentation deck that had gone out with 2 minor data inconsistencies, numbers that had shifted after a late analytics update. I had sent a revised version at 8:42 p.m. the night before. At 9:10 a.m. the next morning, the client replied to the earlier version. In the internal Slack channel, Caroline responded first. "Looks like we missed a final alignment check on data. Poppy, can you tighten the review process moving forward?" Public channel, 23 people in it. Again, not cruel, not loud, not humiliating, but precise. Missed. Poppy. I reread the timestamps. I confirmed what I already knew. The client had opened the outdated attachment from an earlier email thread. Still, instead of writing, actually, the corrected version was sent at 8:42 p.m. I replied, "Of course, I'll build an additional verification step." I built the step, I documented it, I added a cross-check protocol that probably should have existed months earlier. But that wasn't the point. The point was this. I had accepted responsibility for something I had not caused. Again. Not because I was weak, because I was strategic. That's what I told myself. Correcting her publicly would create tension. Clarifying details would look defensive. And besides, the issue was minor. Except it wasn't minor. Not cumulatively. Over the next few months, the pattern refined itself. If a designer missed an internal handoff, Caroline would gently say, "We may need clearer coordination from strategy." If a client changed scope after sign-off, she would remark, "We didn't anchor expectations firmly enough." But when praise arrived, the language sharpened. Caroline's leadership kept this campaign aligned. Caroline navigated a challenging client relationship. Caroline's vision saved the pitch. The room absorbed it naturally. I began noticing something else, her timing. Corrections were often public. Praise, when it came my way, was private. "You're doing beautifully," she'd tell me one-on-one. "Don't let small hiccups shake you." Small hiccups. They were never described as strategic oversights on her end. They were framed as growth edges for me. And here's where normalization begins. I started anticipating it. When something wobbled, even slightly, my body would prepare for repositioning. Not dramatic blame, just subtle reframing. And I would preemptively take ownership. I should have escalated sooner. I could have clarified expectations more firmly. I'll tighten that. I became hyper-responsible, not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed absorbing friction was part of being professional. There's a dangerous pride in being the stabilizer. You begin to equate taking on excess weight with strength. Meanwhile, leadership narratives quietly crystallize. Poppy is solid. Poppy is improving. Poppy needs guidance. Caroline is decisive. Caroline corrects issues quickly. Caroline mentors effectively. No one announced this shift. No one wrote it explicitly. It formed through repetition. And repetition is persuasive. The most disorienting part was that she remained kind. She remembered my birthday. She forwarded articles she thought I'd enjoy. She invited me to networking dinners. There was no cartoon villain energy, no sharp cruelty, just strategic positioning. I would lie in bed some nights replaying small phrases. Still learning. Developing ownership. Needs to anticipate better. And I would ask myself, am I being oversensitive? Is this just how leadership language works? Is this mentorship? When you respect someone deeply, your mind resists assigning them manipulative intent. So instead, you turn the lens inward. Maybe I do hesitate too long before pushing back. Maybe I'm not visible enough in meetings. Maybe this is fair feedback. That's how normalization happens. You participate in your own diminishing. You rationalize each small cut as growth, until one day you realize you are carrying the accumulated weight of a narrative you did not author. And here's the truth I can say now calmly. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as a gentle correction, repeated often enough that you begin to doubt your own record. By the end of that quarter, I had stopped expecting public recognition. I had started expecting subtle redirection. And I told myself I could outwork the perception, that if I just became undeniably flawless, the framing would correct itself. I didn't yet understand that perfection does not dismantle a story someone else is carefully maintaining. It simply makes you more useful inside it. There's a moment in every long-standing dynamic when you realize you are no longer being evaluated fresh. You are being managed according to a role. Not your capability, not your results. A role. For me, that realization arrived quietly during a quarterly planning session. We were restructuring teams for a high-value international client. Bigger budget, higher visibility, executive oversight. I had led the internal coordination for 3 of our most stable accounts. My retention rates were strong. My forecasting accuracy was almost clinical. I knew the operational rhythm better than anyone on the strategy side. Naturally, I assumed I would be considered to lead the new account. Not because I wanted status, because I was already doing the work. When the assignments were announced, Caroline positioned herself as the executive lead, expected. But beneath her, she assigned a newer strategist as project lead. Someone talented, yes, but less experienced in complex logistics. I was assigned as support strategy. Support. Again. I waited until after the meeting to ask her about it, calmly, not accusatory. I was curious about the structure, I said. I thought I might be ready to take primary lead. She smiled in that warm, patient way that once felt protective. You are ready in many ways, she said. But this account requires a stronger executive presence. You tend to overabsorb responsibility instead of delegating upward. I blinked. Delegating upward. I manage cross-functional execution already, I replied carefully. Yes, she nodded. But leadership still sees you as more operational than authoritative. We need you to stabilize this one. We need you to stabilize. There it was. Not a critique of my competence. A reinforcement of my function. Stabilizer, support, infrastructure. Reliable, useful, invisible. And the most unsettling part, she said it like praise. You're the backbone, she added. Backbones are essential. They are also hidden. That night, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity beginning to gather around something I had resisted naming. I wasn't being underdeveloped. I was being positioned. Caroline benefited from my steadiness. She could pivot creatively, take bold strategic risks, promise ambitious outcomes, because she knew I would absorb the operational consequences. If timelines stretched, I would recalibrate. If budgets are strained, I would reallocate. If tensions rose, I would soothe. And if something cracked, the narrative already existed. Poppy is still learning ownership. Poppy needs to anticipate better. The role had been assigned gradually, but now it was visible. I thought back to every meeting where I had stayed quiet while she reframed responsibility. Every Slack thread where I had volunteered to tighten systems that weren't broken. Every performance review where growth was attached to my name and leadership to hers. It wasn't that she was sabotaging projects. She was insulating her reputation, and I was the insulation. There's something deeply disorienting about realizing you have been cast in a role you never auditioned for, especially when you helped rehearse it. Because I had leaned into reliability. I had taken pride in smoothing edges. I had believed that absorbing friction was strength. But strength without visibility becomes containment. In that moment, I understood something quietly devastating. No matter how flawlessly I executed, as long as I occupied the stabilizer role, I would never be perceived as the strategist. Because the narrative didn't require me to rise. It required me to catch. I walked back to my desk and opened my notebook again. Instead of reviewing tasks, I wrote a single question at the top of a blank page. Who benefits from my staying here? The answer wasn't emotional. It was structural. Caroline's authority looked cleaner when I carried the operational ambiguity. Leadership saw her as decisive because I handled the complexity before it reached them. I wasn't overlooked. I was useful exactly where I was. And that's when something subtle shifted inside me. Not rebellion, not confrontation, just awareness. Awareness that roles, once assigned, rarely dissolve on their own. They must be outgrown or strategically dismantled. And I began to suspect that growth in this environment would not be granted. It would have to be repositioned. The shift didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, in a moment so small no one else would remember it. We were preparing for a mid-year performance calibration, the kind where department heads align on who is promotion ready and who needs further development. I'd stopped expecting anything dramatic from those meetings. My language in them had grown careful, polished, neutral. Caroline asked me to send her a summary of my achievements for the quarter so she could advocate effectively. I remember sitting at my desk typing it out. Revenue impact, process improvements, client retention metrics, crisis mitigation examples. It was a strong list, measured, verifiable. I sent it at 2:14 p.m. At 3:02 p.m., I walked past a small meeting room on my way to refill my water bottle. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Caroline was on a Zoom call with one of the directors. I wasn't eavesdropping, but I heard my name. She's incredibly dependable, Caroline was saying. Honestly, I'd be lost without her operationally. A pause. Yes, she sent through a strong self-review, but I do think she still struggles with strategic anticipation. When things go wrong, she can get buried in the details instead of surfacing risk early. I stopped walking. My heart didn't race, it slowed. Because I had surfaced the risk early, repeatedly, with documentation. There was another pause. No, she continued, softer. I'm not saying she's not valuable. She absolutely is. I just don't think she's quite ready to own executive outcomes independently. Executive outcomes. The phrase landed like a quiet verdict. I stepped away before she could see me. I walked back to my desk and sat down carefully, as if something fragile might shatter if I moved too fast. For the first time, the pattern aligned without resistance in my mind. Public reframing, private advocacy, but diluted. Language that kept me competent, but not promotable. She wasn't destroying me, she was containing me. And that containment protected her. Because if I became visible as an independent strategist, I would no longer be exclusively within her shadow. My successes would begin attaching to my name alone, and perhaps, though I can't know her inner thoughts, that threatened the hierarchy she had built. I opened my notebook again. Instead of reviewing tasks, I flipped backward. I reread months of meeting notes. Every flagged risk, every documented pivot, every timeline extension is approved in writing. I wasn't misremembering. The narrative about my anticipation gaps simply wasn't supported by the record. That's when the internal shift happened. Not anger, clarity. Up until that day, I had been trying to work harder inside the story she was telling. That afternoon, I realized I needed to understand the story itself. Because effort doesn't correct framing, positioning does. I didn't confront her about the call. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't storm into the director's office with timestamps. Instead, I did something much quieter. I stopped seeking reassurance. That was the real shift. I stopped going to her after meetings to ask, was that okay? I stopped requesting guidance on how to improve perception. I stopped volunteering to absorb ambiguous responsibility in public threads. Externally, nothing dramatic changed. Internally, everything did. When she would gently reposition accountability in meetings, I didn't nod reflexively anymore. I let silence stretch, just slightly, not defiant, just still. And in that stillness, I began observing more strategically. Who spoke after she reframed something? Who nodded? Who looked uncertain? Who stayed quiet? I realized that leadership rarely dug into detail. They accepted the summary presented most confidently. Caroline wasn't manipulating facts outright. She was curating emphasis. And I had been allowing my own emphasis to disappear. That Tuesday afternoon, sitting at my desk with the hum of printers in the background, I made a decision no one else could see. I would no longer compete inside her narrative. I would build my own. Not loudly, not reactively, but structurally. I didn't need to accuse her. I didn't need to expose her. I needed leverage. And leverage doesn't come from emotion. It comes from preparation. That was the day something shifted. Not in the office. In me. After that Tuesday, my silence changed. Before, it had been reflex. Now it was deliberate. There's a difference between silence that shrinks you and silence that observes. In meetings, when Caroline subtly reframed responsibility, I no longer rushed to cushion it. I didn't contradict her. I didn't defend myself. I let the words settle in the room. And then, if clarification was needed, I asked questions instead of offering apologies. Just to confirm, I would say evenly, are we referring to the timeline adjustment approved on March 12th? Not accusatory, not emotional, precise. Sometimes she would nod and move on quickly. Sometimes she would rephrase. But the pattern began to shift. Not dramatically, just enough that the narrative wasn't entirely frictionless anymore. What fascinated me most was how quickly people interpreted my calm as submission. Designers would message privately, "You handled that well." Account managers would whisper after meetings, "I don't know how you stay so composed." They assumed I was enduring. They didn't realize I was recalibrating. Silence became data collection. I began mapping conversational patterns the way I once mapped project workflows. When did Caroline take full ownership publicly? When did she use we? When did my name appear attached to correction language? I noticed something consistent. Responsibility flowed downward when outcomes were unstable. Authority flowed upward when outcomes were celebrated. It was subtle enough to avoid scrutiny, elegant enough to feel unintentional, but it was patterned. And patterns can be documented. So I started documenting more intentionally, not in a dramatic dossier building way, in my normal methodical way. After every major meeting, I sent recap emails, clear bullet points, approved decisions, timeline acknowledgements, scope confirmations. I CC'd relevant stakeholders, including leadership when appropriate, neutral tone, no commentary, just record. If Caroline requested a pivot, I summarized it in writing. Per today's discussion, we're adjusting strategy direction to X, which will require Y additional production days, confirming we're aligned on updated launch date of aligned. That word became important because alignment in writing prevents selective memory later. Externally, I looked exactly the same. Still calm, still organized, still support strategy. But internally, my posture had shifted from absorber to architect. And interestingly, Caroline seemed to sense something had changed, though she couldn't quite name it. She began softening her phrasing slightly in public forums. Instead of Poppy's still learning to anticipate, it became we're refining our anticipation process. Small adjustment, not an apology, just less pointed. One afternoon, she stopped by my desk again. "You've been quieter lately," she said, tone light. "I've been focused," I replied. She studied me for half a second longer than usual. "Good," she said. "Focus looks good on you." It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't entirely neutral either. Silence unsettles people when they're used to you filling space with reassurance. What she likely interpreted as withdrawal was actually repositioning. I stopped volunteering to take ownership of ambiguous issues unless they were genuinely mine. When a designer missed a deadline, I redirected responsibility gently. I believed the file delivery was pending creative approval. I'd state calmly. No edge, just a fact. What surprised me most wasn't her reaction. It was the leadership's. When information was presented cleanly and without emotion, they adjusted quickly. They weren't invested in protecting her narrative. They were invested in clarity. And clarity, I realized, had been available to me all along. I had simply prioritized harmony over accuracy. There's a dangerous myth that quiet people lack power. In reality, quiet people often understand power more intimately because they watch it move. By the end of that quarter, the dynamic hadn't exploded. Nothing dramatic had occurred. But the weight no longer shifted as easily. When something wobbled, I didn't rush to catch it alone. I let gravity reveal its source. And something else happened too. Something more personal. I stopped needing her validation. That was the quietest revolution of all. Because once you stop seeking approval from someone who benefits from your containment, their influence shrinks. Silence, chosen strategically, isn't retreat. It's positioning. And I was positioning myself for something she didn't yet see coming. Not confrontation, not exposure. Leverage. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. To everyone else, I was still Poppy. Calm, organized, steady. Still, the woman with the black notebook. Still the one who sent clear recaps and caught logistical gaps before they widened. What they didn't notice was that my preparation had evolved from competence to architecture. I stopped thinking quarter to quarter. I started thinking structurally. If the narrative about me was strong operational support, still developing executive ownership, then I needed evidence that contradicted it, not emotionally, but institutionally. So I began building 3 quiet pillars. Pillar 1, cross-department visibility. Instead of routing most updates through Caroline, I began looping in stakeholders directly, when appropriate. Not bypassing her, not excluding her, including others. When operations improved, I documented the impact in shared channels. When we implemented the revised escalation framework in April, we reduced turnaround delays by 18%. Neutral, measurable, traceable. Numbers travel further than feelings. I also volunteered for cross-functional task forces that weren't under Caroline's oversight. Procurement optimization, internal workflow redesign, and vendor negotiation panels. Not glamorous, but visible to leadership outside her narrative. If she were the curator of my reputation within strategy, I would expand the audience. Pillar 2, decision traceability. I refined my documentation habits even further. Every pivot request, every approved deviation, every client-driven change, captured. I created a private digital archive organized by project and date, not to weaponize, to clarify, because clarity is leverage. The archive revealed something interesting. Out of 12 major project delays over the past year, 9 had originated from strategic shifts initiated at the executive level, not operational breakdown. Yet in performance language, the phrase anticipation gap continued attaching to me. The discrepancy wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent. Patterns matter more than incidents. Pillar 3, direct feedback loops. This one required more courage. Instead of waiting for Caroline's filtered summaries after calibration meetings, I began requesting direct feedback sessions with department heads. Not in a confrontational way, in a developmental one. I'd value your perspective on how I can strengthen executive presence. I would say calmly. When you frame a request as growth, people respond honestly. And here's what surprised me. Several directors expressed no concern about my anticipation skills. In fact, one of them said, "You're one of the few who flag risk early. I rely on your foresight." I didn't react emotionally. I simply asked, "That's helpful to hear. In calibration, is there a perception I should be aware of?" There was a pause. "Well," he admitted gently, "Caroline sometimes positions you as still maturing into ownership. I assume that's part of your development plan." There it was. Not malicious, not hidden, just accepted as fact because it had been repeated consistently. I thanked him. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I went back to my desk and wrote one sentence in my notebook. The narrative is stable because no one has seen contradictory data presented cleanly. That realization changed everything. Up until then, I had imagined leverage as something dramatic. A moment of revelation, a hidden email thread, a confession. In reality, leverage was simpler. It was an alignment between perception and documented truth. And that alignment required timing. I didn't rush. Instead, I focused on strengthening my independent relationships. Clients began requesting me directly for strategic alignment calls. I made sure those calls were summarized in shared notes with clear ownership markers. Strategic direction adjusted following executive recommendation from CR. Risk surfaced in week 3, mitigation plan proposed by PG. Just initials, no accusation, just record. Over time, something subtle shifted in the ecosystem. People began referencing my foresight without prompting. Let's check with Poppy. She usually flags these early. Poppy's escalation framework worked well last quarter. Caroline noticed, not overtly, but I could feel it in the way she paused before speaking in meetings, the way she glanced at me when presenting the timeline risks. She wasn't threatened, but she was recalculating. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had also started exploring options beyond the agency. Not because I wanted to flee, because optionality is power. I had updated my portfolio quietly, strengthened my LinkedIn presence subtly, reconnected with former colleagues now in senior roles elsewhere. No dramatic job hunt, just doors that could open if needed. Preparation isn't revenge, it's insulation. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel contained. I felt strategic, and the strategy is patient. The most powerful moves rarely announce themselves. They accumulate, they align, they wait. Leverage rarely arrives with fireworks. It arrives with confirmation. Mine came on an ordinary Thursday morning during budget reconciliation for the international account I hadn't been allowed to lead. The newer strategist, kind, capable, but overwhelmed, had escalated a financial discrepancy. The client was questioning an unexpected overage tied to a late-stage campaign extension. Leadership requested a clean internal breakdown before responding. Caroline asked me to help untangle it. Of course she did. I opened the archived folder I had built months earlier. Date stamps, scope revisions, approval threads, timeline adjustments. The overage traced back to a strategic repositioning decision Caroline had proposed after the second performance review checkpoint, a shift that required expanded production hours and additional vendor contracts. I had documented the impact at the time, and I had summarized it in writing. Per executive recommendation, repositioning to X will require a budget extension of approximately £48,000, confirming approval before vendor lock. The reply from her 6 months earlier. Approved. Let's proceed. We'll justify performance upside later. I stared at that email for a long moment, not in shock, in stillness. Because this wasn't ambiguous. This wasn't an interpretation. This was traceable causality. The financial overage, now being framed as a forecasting misalignment, subtly drifting toward operational oversight, had originated from a strategic executive pivot, documented and approved. I compiled the reconciliation summary carefully. No commentary, no tone, just timeline. Initial scope approved on date. Strategic pivot requested by CR on date. Budget extension projected and documented on date. Approval confirmed in writing. Vendor contracts executed accordingly. I attached screenshots of the relevant threads. Then I sent the summary to Caroline first. Subject line: budget reconciliation. Documented timeline for review. She called me within 5 minutes. Her voice was even. "I see what you've put together," she said. "Yes," I replied calmly. "It aligns with our documentation." A pause. Another recalculation. "Let's simplify the language before sharing with leadership," she suggested. "We don't need to overemphasize internal pivots." There it was. Simplify. Translation: dilute authorship. "I can streamline formatting," I said evenly, "but I believe clarity around decision points will help avoid confusion." Silence. Not anger. Assessment. "You're right," she said finally. "Clarity is important." When the summary reached leadership, it did not accuse anyone. It simply traced the decision pathway accurately. For the first time, the weight did not drift toward me automatically, because the documentation made drift impossible. Leadership responded with a short note. "Appreciate the clear breakdown. Let's ensure executive-level pivots include explicit budget reforecast alignment going forward." Executive-level pivots. The language shifted. Not dramatically, but officially. That was the reveal. Not explosive. Not humiliating. Just structural correction. And in that moment, I understood something profoundly steady. I didn't need to expose her. I needed to remove ambiguity. Because ambiguity had been her shield. Documentation removed it. Later that afternoon, she stopped by my desk again. Her posture was composed. "You handled that well," she said. The same word she had used months earlier, after repositioning the timeline, blame onto me. But this time they carried a different tone. Less patronizing, more measured. "I focused on alignment," I reply. Sid. She studied me. "You've grown," she said quietly. Maybe I had, or maybe I had simply stopped shrinking. What she didn't know was that the leverage wasn't the email thread. It was the pattern of consistency behind it. One corrected narrative might be dismissed, but months of documented alignment? That reshapes perception. I felt no triumph, no rush, just clarity. The story about me, still learning ownership, had a visible contradiction now, and it had been revealed without confrontation, without emotion, without accusation. That was power. And power, when exercised quietly, unsettles more than outrage ever could. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open. I wrote a single sentence: clarity shifts gravity. Because once gravity shifts, it rarely returns to its old center. But clarity alone wasn't enough. I now had something else. Proof that I could alter the narrative without exploding it. And that meant I had options. Real ones. The next decision would not be about survival. It would be about direction. Once you realize you have leverage, the temptation is to use it immediately, to correct every misrepresentation, to replay every meeting in your mind and imagine how you could now speak differently, to reclaim all the moments where your silence once protected someone else. But power used impulsively is just emotion-wearing strategies clothing. I knew that. The budget reconciliation had shifted gravity slightly, but officially. Leadership language now acknowledges executive-level pivots. That phrase mattered more than any apology would have. But I had to decide what I wanted next. There were 3 paths in front of me. Option 1, confront Caroline directly. Lay out the pattern. Reference the documentation. Ask why she had positioned me the way she had. It would be honest. It would be uncomfortable. And it would likely become personal. But confrontation, even calm confrontation, would shift the relationship into something adversarial. And I didn't want drama. I wanted a trajectory. Option 2, stay, continue documenting, and slowly outgrow her shadow from within. This path required patience, possibly years of it. It meant proving consistency until leadership perception recalibrated fully. It was safe, measured, and exhausting. Because even if gravity had shifted slightly, the structural hierarchy remained intact. She still curated access to the most visible opportunities. She still controlled strategic framing in executive rooms I wasn't always present in. Option 3, redefine my leverage entirely. Not by fighting for recognition inside a system that had already assigned me a role, but by stepping into a space where I wasn't pre-positioned. The idea didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived during a quiet call with a former colleague now leading operations at a fast-growing consultancy in London. We had reconnected months earlier, casually. That was part of my preparation. Optionality, not escape. On that call, she said something simple. We're looking for someone who can architect scalable strategy operations. Someone who understands risk early and builds frameworks around it. Architect, risk early, frameworks. It was as if she were reading the margins of my notebook. She asked if I'd ever consider relocating. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked questions about authority lines, about executive visibility, about direct reporting structures. The more she described it, the clearer something became. In her environment, operational foresight wasn't considered developmental. It was considered leadership. After the call ended, I sat very still. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't dramatic departure energy. It was alignment. I could stay and slowly correct a narrative written about me. Or I could enter a room where no such narrative existed, where my first impression would not be support. It would be architect. The decision crystallized quietly. I would leave. Not angrily, not abruptly, not reactively. Strategically. But here's what made it irreversible. I would not announce my search. I would not negotiate for a counteroffer. I would not use the external offer as leverage to extract validation. Because validation from someone who benefited from my containment was not growth. It was a temporary correction. If I left, it would be clean, on my terms. With documentation intact and reputation clarified, that was the decision. Irreversible, not because of drama, but because it shifted my orientation entirely. I wasn't trying to fix the ecosystem anymore. I was choosing a different one. In the weeks that followed, I prepared quietly. Portfolio refined, case studies anonymized and formatted. Impact metrics are clearly articulated. I interviewed without performance, just facts. Every conversation reinforced what I had already begun to understand. The skills framed as supportive in one environment were executive foresight in another. Context defines perception, and perception defines trajectory. The offer came 6 weeks later. Senior strategy operations lead, direct access to the executive board, clear ownership over structural frameworks. I accepted within 24 hours. Not because I was escaping, because I was stepping. I drafted my resignation letter that night. Calm, professional, 2 weeks notice. No accusation, no explanation beyond aligned growth opportunity. And as I closed my laptop, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief. Authority. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself. The kind that chooses. Once I accepted the offer, everything became quieter. Not externally, internally. Because when you've already decided to leave, the urgency to correct every misperception dissolves. You stop fighting gravity in a building you're about to exit. My resignation meeting with Caroline was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Monday. I walked into her office with the same black notebook I had carried for 3 years. I placed it on the table between us, not symbolically, just habitually. I've accepted a new role, I said calmly. I'll be transitioning out over the next 2 weeks. Her expression didn't fracture. She was too composed for that. But there was a flicker, surprise, quickly masked by professionalism. Oh, she said softly. I didn't realize you were looking. I wasn't actively, I replied. The opportunity aligned. Aligned. I chose that word carefully. She asked about the role, the title, the reporting line. When I mentioned direct executive access, she paused almost imperceptibly. That's significant, she said. It is, I agreed. She nodded slowly. I'm proud of you. The sentence sounded sincere, and maybe it was. But pride and control are not the same thing. She asked if there was anything the agency could offer to keep me. This was the moment I had anticipated most carefully. No, I said gently. I've already committed. No counteroffer leverage, no negotiation, no conditional loyalty. Clean. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved deliberately. I documented every process I owned, created transition guides, clarified vendor contacts, outlined escalation frameworks. I made myself replaceable, but not diminishably so. Leadership requested an exit conversation, not HR, the actual executive team. That mattered. In that meeting, they asked what had influenced my decision. I didn't mention Caroline. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount reposition blame. I spoke structurally. I'm looking for an environment where operational foresight is positioned as strategic leadership, I said calmly, where risk anticipation isn't framed as development, but as executive ownership. No accusation, just description. One of the directors leaned back thoughtfully. That's fair, he said quietly. Fair. That word carried more weight than an apology ever could. Meanwhile, something subtle began happening inside the agency. Without announcing anything, I stopped cushioning conversations. When issues surfaced during transition, I referred back to documented decisions cleanly, as confirmed in April, per executive pivot on, aligned approval noted on, no tone shift, just precision. The effect was noticeable. Weight didn't drift toward me automatically anymore. It redistributed more accurately. Caroline remained composed, supportive in meetings, publicly gracious about my departure. But there was a new restraint in her language. Where she once might have said, Poppy's still refining ownership, she now said, Poppy built much of our operational stability. Built. Ownership language. It arrived only after my exit was secured, which confirmed what I had already understood. Recognition offered when you're leaving is acknowledgement, not empowerment. In the final week, clients began emailing directly. Who will we work with after you? You've been the consistent thread. I forwarded those emails neutrally into transition threads. No commentary, just record. On my last day, I cleared my desk slowly. The office buzzed around me as usual, designers debating fonts, account managers juggling deadlines. Nothing looked dramatically different, but the ecosystem had shifted slightly. Not because I confronted it, because I withdrew strategically. The morning I handed in my access card, Caroline walked me to the elevator. You've grown a lot here, she said. I have, I replied. She hesitated, then added, I hope you know I always wanted the best for you. I met her gaze calmly. I believe that, I said. And I did, in a complicated way. Wanting the best for someone doesn't mean you're willing to lose the advantages they provide. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. No anger, no triumph, no dramatic soundtrack in my head. Just stillness. Moving in silence had never been about avoidance. It had been about control. And now, for the first time in 3 years, my trajectory wasn't curated by someone else's narrative. It was self-authored. Consequences rarely arrive as explosions. They arrive as an absence. 2 weeks after I started my new role in London, I received a message from one of the designers at my old agency. Things feel different without you. I smiled at the screen. Different is a quiet word. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't dramatize. It just acknowledges a shift in equilibrium. At my new firm, I was immersed immediately in executive planning sessions. Not as support, not as background infrastructure, as an architect. When I flagged risks during a strategy review, the CEO turned to me directly. What's your mitigation proposal? No one translated my foresight into still developing. It was simply leadership. Meanwhile, back in Manchester, gravity had adjusted. I didn't need insider gossip to know that. Systems reveal strain when their stabilizer leaves. 3 weeks in, another former colleague called me during her lunch break. They're struggling with the Berlin rollout, she said carefully. Timeline slipped again. Why? I asked. A pause. Well, there was a late-stage repositioning, and the budget wasn't reforecast early enough. Executive pivot. Unanchored budget. The same pattern. Only now, there was no quiet documentation architect catching the impact before it reached leadership. I felt no satisfaction hearing it, just confirmation. Patterns don't dissolve when one person leaves. They reveal themselves. Over the next month, I heard fragments. Client retention dipped slightly. Internal deadlines tightened under pressure. Leadership meetings grew more detailed about process accountability. When I was there, accountability had drifted downward through subtle language. Without me, there was no obvious operational container to absorb ambiguity. Weight had to land somewhere else. Eventually, it began landing where it originated. I heard that Caroline was under more direct scrutiny during executive reviews. Not attacked, not humiliated. Questioned. Can we trace where this pivot was approved? Was budget alignment documented at the executive level? Who signed off on scope changes? Questions that once would have quietly redirected toward operational refinement now pointed upward. Not because I exposed her, because the insulation was gone. And insulation once removed reveals temperature. Back in London, my new environment felt almost disorientingly transparent. If I proposed a structural adjustment, it was debated openly. If a pivot was requested, budget implications were discussed in the same breath. There was no soft redistribution of ownership. Authority and responsibility traveled together. That alignment changed something in me too. I stopped bracing for subtle repositioning in meetings. I stopped rehearsing defensive clarifications in my head. When your environment doesn't require self-protection, your energy reallocates toward creation. One afternoon, about 2 months into my new role, I received an email from a senior director at my former agency. Subject line, quick catch-up? We scheduled a call. He didn't waste time. We've been reassessing some of our calibration language, he said. In hindsight, we may not have positioned your contributions accurately. In hindsight, I let the phrase settle. I appreciate that, I replied evenly. He cleared his throat slightly. Your documentation practices. We're implementing similar standards across strategy now. I smiled faintly. That's good to hear. There was a pause, then, if circumstances were different, would you ever consider returning? It wasn't an offer. It was a temperature check. No, I said gently. I'm where I need to be. I'm yummy middle. And I meant it. Because here's what people misunderstand about quiet exits. They think the power lies in watching the system struggle without you. It doesn't. The power lies in no longer needing the system to validate what you already proved. Back in Manchester, the consequences weren't dramatic. No public fallout, no exposed scandal. Just structural correction. And structural correction is more enduring than spectacle. Caroline and I never had a dramatic final confrontation. But the ecosystem that once benefited from my containment had to reorganize without it. And reorganization always reveals who was carrying what. The consequences had begun. Not loudly, but permanently. About 4 months after I left, Caroline called me. Not a message, not an email. A call. I watched her name appear on my screen for a full 3 seconds before answering. Hi, Poppy. Her voice sounded the same. Composed, measured, warm at the edges. Hi, Caroline. There was no immediate small talk. I've been meaning to reach out, she said. Things have shifted here. Shifted. I let her continue. There's been more scrutiny around executive decisions. Leadership is implementing stricter documentation protocols. I almost smiled. I said calmly. A pause. I suppose I underestimated how much structural support you were providing, she admitted. There it was. Not an apology. An acknowledgement. Underestimated. For years, I had been described as still developing ownership. Now the absence of my ownership had become visible. I was doing my job, I replied evenly. Yes, she said quietly. You were. There was something in her tone I hadn't heard before. Not guilt. Not defensiveness. Recognition. I want to be honest with you, she continued. In calibration meetings, I framed some of your growth areas in a way that may have limited how others perceived your readiness. May have limited, soft language, but clear enough. I didn't interrupt. I believed I was protecting you, she added, from executive pressure, from exposure before you were ready. Protecting. The word landed strangely. Protection that restricts visibility is still containment. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully. Silence stretched between us. I realize now, she continued, that I may have also been protecting myself. There it was. Not a dramatic confession, just quiet clarity. Executive pivots had been easier to manage when operational ambiguity drifted downward. Without me, that ambiguity had nowhere subtle to land. It's taken some difficult conversations here to understand that, she said. Difficult conversations. Panic had likely surfaced quietly in boardrooms. Questions that once dissolved had lingered longer. The insulation was gone. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. I never intended to undermine you, she said softly. I know, I replied. And I meant that too. This wasn't a story about a villain plotting sabotage. It was about incentives. Systems reward those who curate perception effectively. And she had curated hers well, until the structure supporting it shifted. I suppose this is my apology, she said finally. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't tearful, it wasn't theatrical. It was late, but sincere. I accept it, I said. And I did. Not because I needed it. Because holding resentment would tether me to an environment I had already outgrown. We spoke for another few minutes about neutral things, industry shifts, mutual contacts, the speed of London growth. When the call ended, I sat at my desk in the new office overlooking the Thames. The light was different here, sharper somehow. I thought about timing. Apologies that arrive after structural consequences are not redeemable. They are recognition. And recognition, when it comes too late to alter the trajectory, changes nothing externally. But it can recalibrate something internally. I didn't need her regret to validate my experience anymore. The validation had come through structural proof, through leadership language shifts, through executive calls I now participated in directly. Too late to fix it doesn't mean too late to understand it. She understood now. And that was enough. Because the irreversible part wasn't her misframing. It was my departure. You can correct the narrative. You can implement new documentation protocols. You can even apologize. But once someone steps into an environment where their strength is accurately positioned, they rarely return to one that requires them to shrink. Too late doesn't always mean dramatic collapse. Sometimes it just means the door has already closed quietly. Our real confrontation didn't happen on the phone. It happened 3 months later in person. I was back in Manchester for a client conference. Different company, different badge on my blazer, but the same city air, the same familiar streets. During a networking reception, I saw her across the room. Caroline. She looked exactly as she always had, poised, elegant, self-contained, if anything slightly more measured. Our eyes met. There was no avoidance. She walked toward me first. Poppy, she, offering a small composed smile. Caroline. We stood facing each other with the soft hum of industry chatter around us, glasses clinking, polite laughter, professional theater. You look well, she said. I am, I reply. It wasn't defensive, it was factual. There was a pause. Not awkward, just deliberate. I've been thinking a lot about our time working together, she said. I have too, I answered. She nodded slightly. I didn't always realize how my framing shaped perception. Framing. A precise word. I know, I said calmly. I didn't always realize how much I allowed it. That stopped her for a fraction of a second. You allowed it? She asked. Yes. Not an accusation, not blame. Just shared accountability. Because here's the truth I had come to understand. She positioned me, but I consented to silence. She curated a narrative, but I prioritized harmony over correction. We both participated in the structure. I thought I was mentoring you, she said softly. You were, I replied, in many ways. I didn't deny her contribution. She had taught me strategic thinking, client psychology, and executive tone. Those lessons were real. But mentorship shouldn't require containment, I added evenly. The words hung there, not sharp, just clear. She absorbed them. No, she said quietly. It shouldn't. There was no defensive pivot, no justification for executive pressure, no reframing, just acknowledgement. Around us, conversations continued. Waitstaff moved between clusters with trays of wine. The world didn't pause for confrontation, and neither did we. I hope you know, she said after a moment, that I never doubted your capability. I know, I replied. I just needed you to reflect it publicly. Silence again. Then she gave a small nod, the kind that signals understanding without debate. I see that now. There was nothing more dramatic to say. No speech, no final declaration. Just two women standing in the awareness of a dynamic that had run its course. I'm glad you left, she said unexpectedly. I raised an eyebrow slightly. You forced structural clarity, she continued, for all of us. Not revenge, not exposure. Correction. I'm glad too, I said. And I was. Because confrontation without heat isn't about winning. It's about naming truth without aggression. We didn't hug. We didn't exchange promises to reconnect. We parted the way professionals do, with composure. As I walked away, I didn't feel triumph. I felt integration. The version of me who once nodded silently in boardrooms would have avoided this conversation entirely. The version of me standing there now didn't need to escalate it. Clarity doesn't require volume, and power doesn't require spectacle. Sometimes confrontation is simply two people acknowledging the architecture they built together, and why one of them had to leave it. When people ask me now what changed, I don't talk about Caroline. I talk about posture. Not physical posture, though that shifted too. Internal posture. I used to enter rooms scanning for where I fit. Now I enter rooms assessing what's needed. There's a difference. At my new firm, I sit at executive tables regularly. Not as the youngest voice, not the quietest, not as support. As an architect, when discussions heat up around ambitious pivots, I don't brace for blame drift. I ask one question. What structural impact are we accepting with that shift? It's not emotional, it's not resistant, it's strategic. And the room adjusts accordingly. I don't over-explain anymore. I don't volunteer to absorb ambiguity just to maintain harmony. I don't soften my clarity to make it more comfortable. But I also don't harden. That's important. This isn't a story about becoming ruthless. It's a story about becoming aligned. For years, I believed being easy to work with was the same as being valuable. Now I understand that value without visibility becomes utility. And utility is often replaceable or repositionable. Authority isn't loud, it's consistent. When I flag risk now, it's documented automatically at the executive level. When I propose frameworks, they're attributed directly. When something succeeds, ownership is shared transparently, not because I demand credit, because I no longer allow ambiguity to distort authorship. I've also changed something more personal. I no longer confuse mentorship with validation. Mentorship can challenge you. It can refine you. It can even critique you. But if it consistently diminishes your visible authority while increasing your invisible workload, it's not development. It's containment. I mentor 2 junior strategists now. I am careful, almost meticulous facade about how I frame them in rooms they aren't in. If something wobbles, I trace it honestly. If something succeeds, I name the authorship clearly. Because narratives once repeated solidify. And I know firsthand how subtle repetition shapes identity. Do I regret those 3 years? No. They sharpened me. They forced me to distinguish between competence and positioning. They taught me that documentation is power, that silence can be strategic, that departure can be the most articulate response. And most importantly, they taught me that quiet people are often underestimated until they stop asking for permission to be seen. I still carry the black leather notebook, but now when I open it, I'm not asking, who benefits from me staying here? I'm asking, what architecture am I building? Because the shift wasn't about escaping someone else's narrative. It was about authoring my own. And once you do that, once you understand how perception is constructed, you move differently. You speak differently. You decide differently. Not louder, just clearer. I'm not the woman who is quietly absorbing mistakes anymore. I am the woman who designs systems where mistakes are traceable to their source, calmly, accurately, without spectacle. And that difference has changed everything. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a dramatic moral. Expose them, call it out publicly, fight harder. But that's not what this story is about. This story is about something quieter. It's about narrative gravity. In every workplace, in every partnership, in every mentorship, there is a story being told about you. Sometimes it's spoken aloud. Sometimes it's implied through tone, repetition, or subtle framing. And if you don't participate in shaping it, someone else will. Not always maliciously. Sometimes protectively, sometimes strategically, sometimes unconsciously, but consistently. I used to believe that if I worked flawlessly enough, perception would correct itself. It doesn't. Effort doesn't automatically rewrite narrative. Clarity does. Documentation does. Positioning does. And sometimes departure does. The lesson wasn't that Caroline was a villain. She wasn't. She operated within incentives that rewarded perception management, and I operated within a belief that harmony was more important than visibility. We both benefited from that dynamic until we didn't. What changed my life wasn't exposing her. It was recognizing the architecture and deciding I no longer wanted to live inside it. There's power in staying and correcting the system, but there's also power in leaving quietly, without spectacle, once you've understood your leverage. Because quiet exits speak in a language that systems understand. Absence. If you're in a position right now where mistakes seem to drift toward your name, if your mentorship feels supportive in private but diminishing in public, if you're praised for being reliable but never positioned as decisive, ask yourself one calm question. Is this growth or containment? And then ask a second one. Do I need to fight this narrative or outgrow it? Not every situation requires departure, but every situation requires awareness. I didn't become louder, I became clearer. I didn't seek revenge, I built optionality. And when I left, I didn't burn bridges. I simply stopped reinforcing a story that limited me. That's quite dominant. Not humiliation, not destruction, alignment. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that someone you trusted was subtly shaping how the world saw you? And if so, what did you choose to do about it?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.